Don't listen.
No, don't worry. He's in Illinois, and he's not around.
My husband, he does that too. Yeah. Just brand new, so. Oh.
That's what we were chasing. We never got past that.
Right.
How are you? Generously here. Good job, Richard Holman.
Good morning, everybody. How are we doing this morning? Good. My name's Dana Newman. I'm the library director here at the Talbot County Free Library, and we are just really excited to have this wonderful partnership with the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution, and I'm looking forward to the wonderful program we're going to have. I would ask if you have cell phones, if you can turn them down and put them on vibrate. And the other thing is we do have a wonderful restroom facilities out here to the right. So if you need to take care of yourself, please do so. I do want to inform you that this program is being live streamed. So if you can try to keep it down so that those people who are listening on the other end can hear what's being said. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Wes Haygood from the Sons of the American Revolution. But thank you very much for being here today.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Thank you so much. As Dana said, my name is Wes.
Mic on. We can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? No, sorry. Well, I'll try to speak up.
Microphone. Thank you.
She's getting one.
Oh, she's getting one. Okay. As I said, I'm looking, but I don't see one. Well, until she gets back, I just want to get started because we're just a couple minutes after 11. My name is Wes Haygood, and I am the president of the local chapter of the SAR, Sons of the American Revolution. We serve residents in Kent County, Caroline County, Queen Anne's County, and Talbot County. That's where our members are, and we serve the communities in those counties. Hello? Is that better? Okay, good. So first of all, I would like to just welcome all of you, and thank you for coming today to learn about Pinch Tillman and also about the Battle of Brooklyn. I'd like to start by welcoming any representatives of the Talbot County Council that are here. Do I have anyone here? I know they're coming. They might be a few minutes late because they're going from event to event today. They have a lot on their plate. I'd also like to welcome, representatives of the Easton Town Council. I think we have Mr. Frank Gonzalez. He's the president of the Easton Town Council. Also, the Talbot Historical Society. Do we have any representatives from the Talbot Historical Society? Okay, they might be sneaking in a few minutes. And then, of course, the Talbot County Free Library, right here. Any members of the Sons of the American Revolution that are here, would you stand up and just kind of let everybody say hello? There we go. There's Mr. Warren, numbers of people. Okay, thank you so much. Do we have any members of the Daughters of the American Revolution here? I'd like to welcome you. Please stand up. Okay. As is usual, they outnumber us, right? Do we have any members of the Patriotic Order Sons of America here? There he is, Dan Daly. And is that your wife with you, Donna Marie? Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And then members of the Constitutional Alliance, Mr. Holman is here, Richard Holman. I'd like to recognize him. And then finally, I'd just like to welcome all the citizens of Easton, Talbot County, the Eastern Shore, and elsewhere. That's the rest of you. Thank you. So in terms of our agenda, that was our welcome. I'd like to just recognize our honored guests, if they're here. Some, as I said, I know will be slipping in as we go because they have other events they're going to. And then after that, I'd like to talk just briefly about why Colonel Tinch Tillman Week. Why are we celebrating that? And then also, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Owen Laurie. And following the introduction, he'll give us the featured presentation, which I'm sure that's why most of you are here. Also, I want to talk briefly about how to donate to the Maryland State Archives Maryland 400 project after the presentation, if anyone is desired to do that. Also, we have some members, direct descendants of Colonel Tinch Tillman here today, and I'd like to recognize them and give them an opportunity, if they so choose, just to say a few remarks, 2 or 3 minutes, about what it means to them to be a descendant of someone who paid such a price for all of us. And then briefly, I'll mention that we are having a seminar today from 2 to 4 p.m. in the Frederick Douglass room. I believe it's right through those doors there, the room on your left as you enter this room, on how to join the SAR and DAR if anyone's interested. And we will actually help you start to create your family tree and then do online research so that we can help you find the documents you need to prove your lineage to one or more patriots. A lot of people don't know, if you have deep roots in America, and by deep roots I'm saying 5 to 7 generations, you have at least one and probably multiple patriot ancestors that in some way contributed to the American Revolution. And there are numbers of different ways that you can contribute. Then I'd just like to, before we leave, thank our sponsors and have a few closing remarks. So let's start with honored guests. Okay, here we go. Mr. Pete Lesher. Is Pete here yet? I know he's at another event. He's going to sneak in a little bit later. And also, I'd like to, again, recognize Mr. Frank Gonzalez, the president of Easton Town Council over there. David Montgomery. Is David Montgomery here? He's not here today. Okay. And then Peggy Maury. Peggy was going to be here with the Talbot Historical Society. She's the president. I don't see her, but she might be slipping in a few minutes. Kayla Weber is the operations manager. Looking for Kayla. Al Silverstein is actually the chairman of the board of the Talbot Historical Society. Okay. Dan Daly, right here. He is the trustee for the Patriotic Order Sons of America, which is another lineage sort of organization that helps to remember what happened during the Revolutionary War and to honor the memory of those individuals. Also, Denise Haygood, who is the regent of the General Perry Benson chapter of the DAR. She's here somewhere. I know. There she is, waving back there at the door. Also, Cindy Jones. She's the regent, which is like the president, of the Samuel Chase chapter. Is Cindy here? Don't see her. How about Bonnie Hall, the regent of the Old Kent chapter? Not here. That's interesting. Okay, Jerry Seiler. Where's Jerry? Oh, she is the librarian of the Maryland State Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. We also have Mr. Richard Holman, the founder of the Midshore Constitution Alliance over there, second row. And Melinda Kath, she's a former Maryland State House docent and guide. Is Melinda here? Again, I know they're coming from St. Mary's County, so it's a long drive, so hopefully they'll slip in a few minutes. You know what it's like when you have to come across that bridge, right? Okay. I'd also like to mention that the library has a display in the back with books about Colonel Tinch Tillman, as well as a few freebie handouts that you can take if you're interested to learn a little bit more about him. The books, obviously, you would need to check out if you have a library card here at the library. But also, as you entered the library to your left, they have a display on the American Revolution. You can't miss it. If you just walk into the main library on the left, the American Revolutionary War, they have a big display with a number of books to educate people about what happened then. And I think that's what I needed to say, and we'll move on to why are we celebrating Colonel Tinch Tillman Week? Well, you may be aware that there are a number of initiatives underway in the United States to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation, which of course occurred on July 4th, 1776. So on July 4th, 2026, there will obviously be a very big celebration, but the celebration started years before and then leads up to that date and then goes all the way until 250 years after the essentially the end of the war and the establishment of the Constitution. So there are going to be events to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation for many, many years, both before today and, as I said, up until 250 years after about 1783. So that's one reason. Now, you'll notice that there are a number of organizations on this slide, America 250, which was founded or appointed, I don't know what the term would be, by the President of the United States, saying we need to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States. And I believe that was Joe Biden who initiated that. Then we also have a Maryland 250 Commission, I guess that's the term. That was founded by our current governor, Wes Moore, to say let's celebrate Maryland's 250th anniversary and all the events associated with the war. Then right in the middle, that is the logo of the Sons of the American Revolution for the anniversary of the 250th anniversary. And of course, we're sponsoring this event today in partnership with the Daughters of the American Revolution, and you can see their logo on the your far right. So that's part of why we're doing this, because we want to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the country. But more specifically, the Talbot County Council and the Easton Town Council both proclaimed or declared October 19th to 24th as Colonel Tench Tillman Week. And those dates are historically significant because on October 19th, that was the day that Charles Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army, if you will, at Yorktown, Virginia. And the very next day, Colonel Tench Tillman was given the responsibility by George Washington to take a letter to the Constitutional Congress in Philadelphia to let them know that the beginning of the end is near. We have conquered the unconquerable British Army there in Yorktown. And so he arrived on October 24th, I guess 1781, to share the news. And the war went on for 2 more years, but that was the beginning of the end. After that, it was really a mopping up exercise, getting rid of the British forts and garrisons that were in the southern part of the country primarily. So that's another reason why we are celebrating Colonel Tench Tillman Week is October 19th to 24th, those 2 dates. And then Tench Tillman himself. Well, why do we want to celebrate and remember him? Well, first of all, he was a local American hero. We can be glad that we live in a place that produced one of the heroes of the Revolution. You could call him a revolutionary father. George Washington did. When he died, he said, one of the pillars of the Revolution has fallen. This is Tench Tillman that George Washington was referring to. He was born in Talbot County. He was educated here in Easton, his early education. Then he went up to Philadelphia in what became the University of Pennsylvania, founded by Benjamin Franklin and others. When the war started, he volunteered as a captain in what is called the Flying Camp. It was an organization put together with representatives from like Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and the purpose of it was to protect the local citizens in the event of an invasion of the British Army, which of course they knew was coming. So Tillman was a captain in the Flying Camp. And then in August of 1776, he joined George Washington's family as one of the, and he was the longest serving aide-de-camp. You might say, well, what's an aide-de-camp? An aide-de-camp, think personal secretary. You can imagine that to facilitate the war effort, there was a lot of communication that had to occur. And they didn't have email, they didn't have printers, they didn't have all the things we have today. And the way that they managed the effort was by writing letters. Letters would come into Washington, he needed to respond, he needed to send letters to people, reports had to go to Congress. You can imagine there was a huge burden that Washington had to facilitate the war, and he needed to do that through communication, which was writing with pen and ink. And once Tench Tillman joined Washington's family, that's what he called the young men who functioned in that role, he stayed for the rest of the war. He was the only one. Other names that you may know that were at one time a aide-de-camp to George Washington was Alexander Hamilton. That's another one that I'm sure everyone knows. But Tench stayed the whole time. And as I said, he performed the historic ride from Yorktown to Philadelphia announcing, Cornwallis is taken. Everywhere he stopped to get a fresh horse, Cornwallis is taken. I need a horse for the Congress, a horse for the Congress. And he would trade horses with some farmer who was probably confused as to who he was and why he was there. But once they heard the good news, they were willing to switch horses. And then the last reason, I think it's the most important in my mind, is Tillman sacrificed his time, his fortune, his family, in the sense that he didn't have a long-term relationship with his family after the war because he died relatively young from disease that he caught during the war. They think it was malaria. They're not 100% sure. He sacrificed and put his reputation on line, obviously his health if he got sick during the war, all of that for the cause of freedom. And I would say this, these people did it for themselves, they did it for their families, their children, but they did it for posterity. If you read their writing, you know they were thinking about us when they took these, took these actions. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, you know, a lot of people would say, well, but he didn't lead any battles, he wasn't a general, he didn't do this, he didn't do that. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things. I did a lot of research about Tillman, and although his primary role was as an aide-de-camp, as a secretary, as a person to do correspondence, he really did a lot more than just write letters. For example, he was designated to prepare reports and send them to Congress to keep Congress aware of what was going on throughout the war. At one point, after the disastrous battle that our speaker is going to talk about in a couple of minutes for the Continental Army, the men were afraid to go into battle in the subsequent days, and they had to because the British weren't done pursuing them, right? And at one point, Tillman actually led men into battle along with some of other George Washington's officers, both the military and the aide-de-camps, because the men were afraid. They weren't going to go into battle again and be, you know, overwhelmed like they were. So they said, well, we're going to lead you, and they led from the front. Also, there were times where Tillman had to take Washington's orders onto the battlefield to tell the generals or colonels, hey, there's another group coming. You can't see them. We can. We're at a higher elevation. Please go over to the left, retreat, move back, whatever. He had to take orders where the lead was flying, if you will, and the cannonballs were coming toward the troops. He had to go into that situation, and he had to give orders on Washington's behalf. He was an impromptu quartermaster. The Army didn't have enough money, supplies, uniforms, food, whatever they needed. There were times where Washington, for example, sent Tillman into New Jersey and said, round up anything you can to feed the troops. We've got like 12 to 15,000 men here, and we have no food for them. So please go find anything that you can. He interviewed British prisoners. He interviewed deserters, anyone that they found who might know something about the enemy. So he actually served as an intelligence officer and tried to get information that would be useful to the Continental cause. I'm not going to steal the thunder of Mr. Lurie, but I will say this. At one point during the Battle of Brooklyn, when Washington was the last person to leave the shore in a boat, Tillman was by his side. And I think that's all I'd like to share about Colonel Tillman. You can see why we want to celebrate this individual. And of course, he is the namesake for our medical chapter of the SAR. Now I'd like to talk about Mr. Lowry. He is a senior archivist at the Maryland State Archives. He specializes in Maryland government and military history during the colonial era and early republic. He is an expert on the Revolutionary War. I've met with him many times over in the Maryland State Archives when I've been doing research, and he's always been an invaluable asset to me, providing, well, check this book out, look in this record, et cetera. You might find what you're looking for. He also has an MA in history from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, a BA from Kenyon College in American Studies. He is the director of the Finding the Maryland 400 Research Project, which is studying the 1st Maryland Regiment and the men who were at the Battle of Brooklyn that he'll be talking about. He's also the author of Maryland's Jews, Military Service in the American Revolutionary Era, The Case of Elias Pollock, which was published in the Journal of Southern Jewish History. And he is currently at work on a social history of the Maryland line. He is going to be giving us a presentation titled Voices of the Maryland 400, Maryland's Revolutionary War Soldiers at the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776. And you're going to be surprised to find out just who these men were that were there. There may not be who you think they were. And then finally, we will have some questions and answers at the end. Hold your questions, write them down, whatever, and Mr. Lowry is going to reserve some time to answer those questions. So please give him a big, warm round of applause.
There we go. Hopefully this will There, hopefully this will get me, and if not, I'll just yell. Wes, I believe you may have walked away with my notes. Okay, well, while we're waiting for that, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. This is such a wonderful event. I am just thrilled to see so many people turning out for an event about the Revolutionary War. It is sometimes a little hard to get a large audience for the American Revolution in Maryland. Maryland is at the disadvantage that the war doesn't really happen here. The revolution itself happens here. There's a turnover in government. Although, as we'll talk a little bit later, it's not as big of a turnover in government as some folks would have liked. But the British don't really do very much here in Maryland. There's a few skirmishes along the Potomac River in southern Maryland, and a little bit of... Thank you. And there's a little bit of action along the Eastern Shore and in the Chesapeake Bay. But the only British regulars who are set foot on the ground in Maryland are the ones who march up with Howe in the... Whoops. I'm just breaking everything today. Excellent. There we go. Okay. Okay. The only actual British regulars who ever set foot in Maryland are the ones who march very briefly through Cecil County on their way to take Philadelphia in the summer of 1777. I should take a moment. I should thank Wes, who's not here at the moment, who has put together just an absolutely amazing event, and I think is just absolutely thrilling how much he's done. To all of the wonderful guests, to our Tillman descendants, and to Dana and Sabina and the rest of the library staff here, who have been very helpful to me with my microphone business. Where are we? So I've been leading this project, studying the soldiers of the Maryland 400 since 2013. It's a very long time to be working on this. It is a project that we have worked on in collaboration with a number of partners, beginning with Washington College in Chestertown, with the Maryland Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, who have been a wonderful partner over many years, and really are the ones who have helped make this possible. And particularly to Major General Jim Adkins, who has been, I would say, he's been the real keeper of the memory of the Maryland 400, long before I even got on this project. The Battle of Brooklyn, just to take us back very briefly, we'll touch on this a little bit more. The Battle of Brooklyn is the first major battle in the American Revolution. It is by far the largest battle in the American Revolution. There are about 30,000 British soldiers, somewhere around 20,000 Americans. The Americans never really figured out how many soldiers they had, which is emblematic of the problems they had at the battle. In the course of the fighting, the American army is surrounded and almost completely destroyed. It's only with a desperate large stand by a group of soldiers, mostly from Maryland, who we now call the Maryland 400, they hold the British off long enough for the rest of the Americans to escape off the battlefield into their fortified camp. In the course of the fighting, the Marylanders lose 256 soldiers, either killed or captured. The first thing I should tell you, so if you don't remember anything else, like if you go home after this sentence, the one thing you should know is that Maryland 400 makes it sound like there are 400 soldiers, but it's not true. Maryland 400, it's actually a Victorian-era term, first see it in the 1890s. And it's hard to know exactly what it refers to. It's possible it's a reference to the Spartan 300 who hold back the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae, those are the guys in the movie. And it may have been a reference to the 400 of New York high society, that at the same time is published the list of Lady Astor's most elite people in New York society. And there are definitely some comparisons that I've seen made that explicitly say, you know, in New York they have their 400, but in Maryland we have our 400 who saved the country. In actuality, there were somewhere around 1,000 soldiers from Maryland who were fighting at the Battle of Brooklyn. We have, over the course of our research, using enlistment records and muster rolls, as well as pension applications, correspondence, pay records, anything we can find, We've compiled the names of about 870 of them. There are some gaps in the records. There are a couple of companies where either the muster roll is completely missing or only about half of it survives. We'll talk about one of those companies in a little bit today. We have written biographies of every one of those soldiers. They are all available on our website. One right there on the bottom of the screen. So please, I hope you'll take a look. Not all of the biographies are very long. For somewhere between half and 2/3 of the soldiers, we don't know any more than their military service. And for some of them, we know even less than their whole service. We just know that they enlisted in early 1776. For many years, the Maryland 400 has been best remembered as a group, to the extent that they've been remembered at all. But they've always remained nearly anonymous as individuals. Certainly, there were people who went on to fame and prominence in Maryland after the war. There are 3 future governors, and governors with important terms in office even. There are senators, congressmen. There are 3 of the first 4 adjutant generals of Maryland. There are state representatives, state officials. There are 2 treasurers, or future treasurers, who fight in this battle, both from Talbot County, as it goes. There are dozens of people who go on, who are young soldiers, young junior officers in the Revolution who fight at Brooklyn, who go on to be senior commanders in the War of 1812. So our goal has been to move beyond their stories. It's about more than just these officers and these people who become famous. We want to learn as much as we can about the individual soldiers, the ordinary men who enlisted, what their military careers were like, and what their private lives were like as well. So we're looking for things like, who were their families, their wives and their children's? Did they have a trade? Were they farmers? Did they own their own land if they were farmers? Or like many people in Maryland, were they tenant farmers? And how did they fare through the next decades? And it's a very turbulent time in American history. The economy collapses in the 1780s and 90s. There are plenty of people from Maryland who leave to go either to Ohio or to Kentucky, primarily looking for new land, land that they get as part of their veteran benefits. Over the course of our research, we have uncovered many wonderful and some touching stories about the soldiers, and I'll touch on some of them in a bit. We have 872 soldiers. We can't get to them all today, so if you have questions about specific people or any ancestors you have, please let me know. Either come up today or send me an email. Hopefully, we can give you at least a little bit of a touch, a sampling of the soldiers who we've looked into. So we're gonna talk a little bit before we get to Brooklyn, before we get to New York. We're gonna talk about who these soldiers are in the months beforehand. So most of these soldiers enlist in the winter of 1776, the early spring, and then they gradually begin to trickle their way into camp. There's a camp in Annapolis and a camp in Baltimore, which is where they have them. I want to talk a little bit about, just sort of picture what this was like. Who are they as collectively as a group? And what was it like to have 1,000 extra soldiers, 1,000 largely young single men pouring into a city like Annapolis, which at the time had a population that was only about 1,000 or 1,500 people. And it must have just been an overwhelming experience. Among these soldiers, there are only 5 who have any prior military experience. 2 of them, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Ware, actually 3 of them, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Ware, Barton Lucas, and Major Thomas Price, were all young officers in the French and Indian War, way back in the 1750s. Thomas Price and another soldier, a private named Nathan Peake, had been part of a contingent of riflemen that Maryland sent to Boston in 1775. None of those 4 individuals are on the battlefield, I should point out. When the Marylanders march out of Brooklyn, they're all either sick or they're still in Maryland. There's one other person, the company's drum major, Thomas Collins. He had been a drum major in the British Army as well. We don't know how long he had served for. He is the only person with military experience from Maryland who's on the battlefield, though as the drum major, he did not have a lot of important duties with the soldiers. He would have been lined up with them in the battle, but he was not in the same capacity necessarily. soldiers who march out, I should take a quick moment to point out this painting of the departure of the Maryland soldiers on their way to New York in July of 1776. It is a wonderful image. Virtually everything in this painting is incorrect. They are, first of all, they're all on horseback, and they're all wearing these lovely, famous, familiar-looking blue uniforms. They didn't have blue uniforms at least for another year. We know what they were wearing. They were wearing hunting shirts, so sort of plain or ordinary clothing, which was cheap and easy for the state to produce. And there would have been no reason for them to be on horseback because they left by boat. The various companies, there's half of them are in Annapolis and half of them are in Baltimore, plus a couple that are scattered along the Eastern Shore mostly. They go by boat up the Chesapeake Bay to what's now Elkton, what they call it Head of Elk. But I love this image. I use it anyway. It is gorgeous. I'm going to slide off here. All right, we'll just move on. Among these soldiers, all of the soldiers, of course, are men. But it would be a mistake to think of any army in the 18th century. Think of the Continental Army was not an all-male place. Soldiers brought wives, children, their whole families would sometimes attend with them, and plenty of unattached women as well. These are women who are cooking, cleaning laundry, selling supplies to the soldiers. All the things that the Army doesn't do. The Army, I'm an archivist, right? So I look at records, we get very deep into it, sort of how government functions. The Continental Army, as an organization, barely functions. There's not enough people sort of in the rear echelon group to make the Army function very well. And they also don't really plan things very well on top of that. So the Army doesn't really have people who cook, and they don't really have people who provide supplies. So soldiers' wives come and do that because it's a way for them to support themselves. One of the colonels from Maryland, Josiah Carville Hall, he writes about this situation in 1779. And he's writing about this at a time where most of the enlistments of the first group of soldiers are beginning to come due. So the Maryland line is about to have a large manpower crisis. Hall writes, "A soldier's pay will not enable him to maintain a family at home, which compels him to bring them with his regiment, where they may share his rations, though little enough for himself. This frequently subjects the brave soldier to punishment by so powerfully interfering with his military duties, and besides, greatly encumbers the march of the Army. Inexperiences of these inconveniences prevents the most considerate and the best of our soldiers from re-enlisting." And it really is a matter of economic necessity. If you are an 18th century woman, especially if, like the bulk of the state, if you're farming, unless you have the money to hire a number of people to work with you, nobody, male or female, can run a farm by themselves, and particularly not a woman who also has responsibilities for feeding everybody, which in the 18th century really is a full-time job all day. And it's not like she can afford to hire help herself because her husband isn't getting paid, so he can't even be sending money home to help out it. So they all go with him. We only know a little bit about who the women were who traveled with the Marylanders overall. In 1776, we only have one name of a person, Margaret Jane Ramsey, who was the wife of Captain Nathaniel Ramsey, who's the commander of the 5th Company. She's also the sister of Charles Willson Peale, famous portraitist, and also James Peale. And James Peale is an officer traveling with this group of soldiers. So James Peale, who grew up in Chestertown, is one of the officers here. So their sister comes with them. She joins the Army right after the Battle of Brooklyn, as news begins to filter in about how horrible of a defeat it had been. She writes, or actually her brother Charles writes, that she decided she would be rather with the Army, whatever her sufferings, than be at a distance and so much tormented. For if she was near the Army, in case of misfortunes, she might possibly be able to help those most dear to her. She travels with the Army the entire time that her husband serves, and she functions as the Maryland officer's unofficial hostess. There are, I am sorry, I'm off a little bit. The soldiers as a group, they're very young, which is, it's not surprising. both in an army as well as in a population that is very young in general. Still, it's striking in a lot of cases, especially when you look at the officers. Daniel Bowie is either 20 or 21 when he's made a captain, while William Sterrett and William Fraser are both 19 when they become lieutenants. Nathaniel Ramsey, who we just talked about, he's 35, which is about what you'd expect for a captain, but his junior officers are 18 and 22. And it's notable that in the course of the battle, many of those junior officers end up taking over. So William Sterrett, he's 19, his captain is sick, and so Sterrett leads the men on the battlefield. The average age of the soldiers is about 24. 70% of them are in their 20s. Only about 15% are teenagers. So sometimes we have this image of young soldiers or young drummer boys, which just isn't really true in the American Revolution. Later in the war, the age of the soldiers drops because they're running out of people who haven't already served, who still can. But at this point, there's still so many people who are ready to enlist. This is the first time that Maryland has raised soldiers. They raise 800 who serve directly in the 1st Maryland Regiment and another 1,000 or so to serve in what they call independent companies. Going along with that, because there are so many people who are eager and ready to enlist, we are pretty sure, we're not 100%, but almost positive that all the soldiers in this unit are white. And that's worth pointing out because every other unit of regular soldiers, of full-time soldiers that Maryland raises in the Revolution is integrated, at least to a certain extent. Even the soldiers who Maryland recruits in the summer of 1776, so just a few months afterwards. And the reason is, to Maryland's government and to sort of white Maryland society, the scariest thing they could imagine was arming and then training in military service African Americans. They assumed that it would be nothing more than an obvious invitation to a slave insurrection. They quickly realized that they don't have a choice, that there aren't enough available white men who are willing to enlist. And so they begin to take on African American soldiers. And at least in Maryland, they fight in integrated units, that they are not relegated to behind the lines duty. They're not just teamsters or cooks. The Continental Army is about, at any given time, as the war goes on, about 3 to 5% African American. And it is the last time that the U.S. Army is integrated until the 1940s, after World War II. So they head off on the road. So they leave in July of 1776. They're traveling, as they later say, about 15 to 20 miles per day on foot, which seems like a lot to us. It was a lot then. It wasn't quite as much then because people were more used to walking. We think about how do you get around in the 18th century. If you own a horse, you can ride a horse, but horses are expensive. You have to put it somewhere. I think anyone who owns a horse today will tell you, owning a horse is expensive, and it was no cheaper in the 18th century. So people are a little bit more prepared to walk. It takes them about a week, and they get to Philadelphia, which is their first stop. And that's where William Sands, who's a 19-year-old lieutenant from Annapolis, he takes a moment to write a letter to his parents, to John and Ann Sands back home, with news of the journey. Sands writes a pair of letters along the way, and they are the only dispatches we get of the Army's progress from an ordinary soldier, from somebody who's not a senior officer. And so they're pretty remarkable in that respect. They're also remarkable, and I'll tell you what this says in a second, those of you who are squinting and hoping you can remember cursive. They're remarkable in another sense, which is the change in the tone you see from them. So in this letter, this is July 20th, he's right before they leave Philadelphia on their way up to New York. And the tone of it is what you'd expect for a young man on an adventure. For Sands and most of the young soldiers in the Army, this is probably their first time away from home. It's probably their first time anywhere without being under the authority of their parents. This is all a very new experience to them. And so he gives brief sort of updates of the march. He says that he's met a family friend who he's been staying with. And he also reassures his parents. He writes, he is very sorry that anybody should raise such false reports. We don't know what the reports are. The girl is not in company with me. She's along with the soldiers in the barracks with 5 more women. I have nothing to say to her, and I hope you will not think any more of it. We would love to know more about that. Otherwise, he wrote, as for news, I have none to acquaint you with, but that we expect to go from here to New York tomorrow. And when we get to camp, I shall write. We are all in good spirits. 3 weeks later, the regiment finally makes it to New York. Sands kept his word, and he wrote again to his parents. By then, the anecdotes he had been telling before had given way to more clear-eyed reports of military preparations. He talks about the measures that had been taken to reinforce New York and try to hold the British out. He mentions that the British have been sailing ships up and down the Hudson River. Sands thinks that the Americans are resisting them, but he is very greatly mistaken, that the British are able to move up and down the river pretty much at will. He reports that yesterday, he says, the enemy had a reinforcement of that damned rascal Dunmore's fleet, as we expect. There was about 40 sail of them. So, Lord Dunmore, who was the former colonial governor of Virginia, had raised a unit of African-American soldiers, promising freedom to any enslaved person, and frankly their families, who could escape to him, which earned great enmity in the colonies. Sands continues, we are ordered to hold ourselves in readiness. We expect an attack hourly. We have lost a great many of our troops. They have deserted us from Philadelphia and Elizabethtown, and a great many are sick in the hospital. There is rations given out at New York for 6,000 men daily. I should be glad to write if you will give me to write to you if you get the first opportunity and let me know the news if there is any in that part of the country. We expect, please God, to winter in Annapolis, those that live of us. The battle that Sands is anticipating comes about 2 weeks later on August 27th. So we're going to talk a little bit about the battle and what's happening, and then we'll talk about who the soldiers are, some of the individuals who get there, maybe tell a few stories. So the Americans have been, the Marylanders have been in New York for about a month by the time the Battle of Brooklyn starts. There are 2 companies, one of them from Talbot County, the 4th Independent, which get there much later than the rest. They had been sent to southern Maryland to reinforce along the Potomac River, where there was some fears of a British attack. They don't get to New York until probably a week or so before the battle. As a result, they are not as directly involved in the fighting, probably because they've just arrived and they're still recovering from the long journey. Although, as we'll talk about a little bit, they are certainly involved. The Americans have somewhere around 10,000 soldiers, maybe a little bit more. What most of them are doing is they are digging fortifications around New York City, and they're getting sick. Part of that is inevitable. Any large gathering of people in 18th century or 19th century is going to breed disease, communicable diseases, typhoid, typhus, smallpox, things like that. Smallpox is a particular risk. There's some other problems, which is that dysentery also runs rampant through the American camp. Because there's so few people with any military experience, the Americans don't know how to properly set up a camp to keep the latrines clear from the drinking water. And so everybody is sick, constantly sick. And it's part of the problem at the Battle of Brooklyn, which is what the American general who had set up the defenses in the area where the battle happened was sick, and he was so sick he couldn't even tell the officers who replaced him what his plans had been. The British have been arriving in New York for a couple of months, off and on. Everybody knows that New York is where the battle is going to happen. The British had withdrawn from Boston in the spring of 1776 with the basic feeling, Boston can't be defended, the terrain is terrible, it's in the middle of a valley, and frankly, it's not worth the effort, because Massachusetts is where the revolution has happened, it's where all these crazy people are from. We're going to go to the rest of North America, which is going to be much more in favor of us, it'll be more pleasant, and New York is far more important than Boston. Anyone from Boston, I apologize. By mid-August, the British have arrived in great force. On August 22nd alone, they land somewhere around 20,000 soldiers. And they land them on sort of the southern end of Long Island or Brooklyn, near where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is. I'll have a map in a second. The Americans think it's a diversion. They're not really sure where the British are. They're not sure how many of them there are. And they think that they know there's a force that's just landed, but they think it's a small group and that the rest of the British are going to land somewhere else. The Americans don't have very good intelligence of what's happening, in part because most of the people who live in that area of what's now Brooklyn and out on Long Island don't really like the American army. They are very loyal to the British, and they think that the Continental Army should go away. And they're not going to help them. They're not selling them food, and they're certainly not telling them where the British are. This is, just to help connect some dots for you, this is what happens to Nathaniel Hale. He gets sent out by Washington to go scout out and see what happens. Hale was thoroughly unprepared for the job, so he's immediately caught and executed. But that's what the problem is, that the Americans don't know where the British are, but they know they're somewhere, and they know it's really going to matter. It's not until a week later, on August 26th, that the Americans finally figured out this is the British, this is really where they're going to attack. At that point, George Washington has just convened a court-martial. They're trying Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Zedwitz, who is a German officer who's in the American Army, who they've caught trying to sell secrets to the British, rather pathetically. The person he was trying to sell them to wasn't even British. And Washington is angry, and he wants to have this whole matter dealt with. He wants to have Zedwitz convicted and cashiered out of the army, so that even as the army begins to mobilize, the Americans begin to go across the East River from Manhattan towards Brooklyn, Washington doesn't end the court-martial, which is a problem because among the soldiers who Washington is deploying out to Brooklyn are the commander of the Delaware Regiment and the first and second in command of the Maryland Regiment, who stay behind for this administrative proceedings while their troops head out to fight. As a result, the Marylanders will not be commanded by William Smallwood, but by this gentleman, Mordecai Gist, 33-year-old merchant from Baltimore. Gist was actually we can say Gist almost had military experience. Gist had, in 1774, had raised one of the first militias, private militia groups in Maryland, where they pledged that they would protect their fellow colonies if the need arose. Gist is among the more militant members of Maryland's revolutionary governors and founders. For example, just last week we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the burning of the Peggy Stewart, the ship that brings tea into Annapolis Harbor. Initially, the revolutionary leaders in Annapolis, who are pretty conservative, all things considered, are willing to just burn the tea and be done with it. And it's not until people from outside of Annapolis, who have less connection to the merchant trades, people from Elkridge and people from Baltimore, namely Mordecai Gist, show up, that things begin to escalate, and there are demands to burn the tea, the ship, Anthony Stewart's house, anything else they can come up with. So eventually they burn the ship as a compromise. That's part of Gist's background. He has a militia, but they haven't really done anything more than parade about in Baltimore and occasionally harass Tories. So they have, to say that he has military experience, we don't want to go too far with this. So we're going to do a quick orientation of where we are and talk a little bit about what happened. At this point, you've heard enough from me, so I'm going to let the soldiers themselves tell the story. We are remarkably lucky that there are a number of firsthand accounts of the Battle of Brooklyn from soldiers from Maryland. So just for a brief orientation, here's Staten Island. So this is where the Verrazano and Irish Bridge is. The British land along here on this end of what's now Brooklyn. Over here we have what they call New York, that's Manhattan. That tiny little shaded area at the bottom is the only place in Manhattan where anybody lives. The Americans are set up in this line of soldiers that runs like this. The Marylanders are right here. They're on the extreme right end of the American lines. There is nobody to their right except for the Gowanus Creek. So Gist sends a long, detailed report of the battle afterwards. He writes, "We began our march to the right side of the battlefield at about 3 o'clock in the morning on August 27th. with about 1,300 men. These are from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and some from Delaware. At about sunrise, we discover the enemy. This is from a soldier in the 5th Company, which is raised mostly in Baltimore and some from Cecil County. We don't know his name. Clearly, he was well educated. We don't think he's the captain who's Nathaniel Ramsey, but he's clearly someone very educated, if not an officer, then somebody who's from the upper class. He writes, "The enemy advanced towards us, upon which Lord Stirling, who's the American general, immediately drew us up in a line and offered them battle in the true English taste. The British army then advanced within about 300 yards of us and began a very heavy fire from their cannons and mortars, for the balls and shells flew very fast, now and then taking off ahead. Our men stood it amazingly well. Not even one of them showed a disposition to shrink. Our orders were not to fire until the enemy came within 50 yards of us. When the British perceived we stood their fire so coolly and resolutely, they declined coming any nearer, although they were treble our number. In this situation, we stood from sunrise till 12 o'clock, the enemy firing upon us the chief part of the time." Or, as William McMillan tells us, and McMillan is a 20-year-old corporal. He's from an immigrant from Scotland. He writes, "We had a pretty severe fight with Jaeger," so those are Hessian soldiers, "and it was a draw battle. There was a good many on each side killed. They retreated, and we did not pursue them. Our men behaved well," said Gist, "and maintained their ground until the enemy retreated about 200 yards and halted. The firing on each side ceased." As the British withdraw, the Marylanders begin to feel as though they have weathered their first real test as soldiers. They have faced the enemy, a fearsome enemy, and the enemy is the one who has retreated. They've backed down. And we know that there are soldiers from this group from the Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware soldiers. There begin to be cheers as the British withdraw. The truth is, though, that the attack the Marylanders had only faced was a diversion. And the rest of the British Army, including a large number of feared Scottish Highland soldiers who are particularly eager to put down this American revolt, the same way their revolt was put down a generation before, they're in the process of slipping around the other side of the American lines and attacking the Americans from the rear. So, Marylanders are over here. This is where their battle has been. While that battle is going on, the British Army marches down this road, along here, where they find a road that goes behind the American lines, which is guarded by tradition by 5 men on horseback, because Washington forgets about it. At which point, the British have, like this, around the left end of the American lines. The Americans are outflanked, nearly surrounded. This is the main goal in 18th century combat, and the British do it without really fighting. They do it just by showing up. The main body of their army, by a route we never dreamed of, had entirely surrounded us and scattered all of our men, except the Delaware and Maryland battalions. Or as McMillan put it, we were surrounded by Hielanders, as he says, on one side, Hessians on the other. And so what happens is, on the left side of the battlefield, which is mostly soldiers from New England and from Pennsylvania and New York, that side where the main body of the British Army is collapses immediately, and people begin to retreat in panic. Excuse me. For most of them, it's their first experience in combat as well. On the other side, where the Maryland and Delaware soldiers are, and a group of Pennsylvanians, things are much better, and they're able to begin withdrawing off the battlefield in better order. As Gist puts it, being thus surrounded with no probability of reinforcement, his lordship, Lord Stirling, ordered me to retreat with the remaining part of our men and force our way through to our camp. And so they're off on their way down this road, the Gowanus Road, heading towards the American fortified camp, which is back here. They get about halfway. And they run into the swampy creek, which is fairly deep in the middle, the Gowanus Creek. Today it's the Gowanus Canal, which is a toxic waste site and running through the middle of Brooklyn. Along their way, so just to sort of picture this in your head, imagine 30,000 people firing muskets and how much the noise and especially the gun smoke it would have been incredibly thick. It would have been hard to see. And so as the Marylanders are marching back towards their camp, on a couple of occasions, British soldiers just sort of stumble out of the smoke, out of the fog. We were ordered to attempt to retreat, which our unnamed soldier, by fighting our way through the enemy, who nearly filled every field and road between us and our lines, our camp. We had not retreated a quarter of a mile before we were fired upon by an advanced part of the enemy, while those upon our rear, the British behind them, were playing on us with their artillery. Our men fought with more than Roman courage, and I am convinced would have stood until we were shot down to a man. We forced the advance party who attacked us to give way. By this point, Washington has finally agreed to finish the court-martial and has released the Maryland officers who can't rejoin their units. So they're watching from the heights above the battlefield. And Smallwood, in his letter, he's just beside himself. As he writes, there then remained no prospect but to surrender or attempt to retreat over this marsh and creek where no person had ever been known to cross. We got a passage down the side of a marsh, seldom before waded over, which we passed and then swam a narrow river, all the time exposed to the fire of the enemy. So Samuel Smith, who at the time is a young captain from Baltimore, later on Smith is a senator, congressman, and general in the War of 1812, tells the story about getting them across the creek. I took my company through a marsh until we were stopped by the dam of a mill, so they're going through the mill pond, which was too deep for the men to ford. I and a sergeant swam over and got 2 slabs of wood, and we ferried over all who could not swim. The Marylanders get about half of their soldiers across. It's a time-consuming process. They're being exposed to some British fire during this. We know that there is one of the other group of Maryland soldiers who's not on the battlefield, men from St. Mary's County. They come and they help cover the retreat across through the swamp and across the creek. Eventually, a larger group of British soldiers arrive, and the rest of the Marylanders who are there are not able to safely get across, and they're going to have to find a new way to go. And so what they're going to do, this is a detail of the same map. This is where they start the battle, and then they march down here, and they get to the creek, and they can't get across. And so those who can't get across, there's about half of the soldiers, they end up marching along this way, trying to find a new way back to their fort. And they end up more or less here where the X is. Gist writes, we were then left with only 5 companies of our battalion when the enemy returned. After a warm and close engagement for nearly 10 minutes, our troops became so disordered, we were under the necessity of retreating to a piece of woods on our right. We formed and made a second attack, but being overpowered with numbers and surrounded on all sides by at least 20,000 men, we were pushed back in much confusion. The impracticability of forcing through such a formidable body of troops rendered it the height of rashness and imprudence to risk the lives of our remaining party in a third attempt, and it became necessary for us to endeavor to effect our escape in the best manner we could. Sterling actually reports that there were 6 charges. It's hard to know. Maybe there were more after Gist and the Marylanders left. Eventually, though, this group of soldiers from Maryland, some from Pennsylvania and Delaware, eventually some of them escape and the rest are captured. We know, actually, when we talk about, so this is the famous stand of the Marylanders. While they do this, they hold back this group of British soldiers who can't get past them, and it allows a large body of a large piece of the Continental Army to escape and get back to the Americans' camp. We don't know if they intended to do this. Like I won't tell you that heroic story that they were trying to. It's an 18th century battlefield. You can't tell what's going on, the noise and the smoke. But we know that they do it, and we know that what's particularly remarkable about this is these are soldiers who haven't been in combat before, and they make their first charge, and they're pushed back, and that's not surprising. That happens to everybody in battles in the Revolution. But then they're able to reform, and they're able to reform under fire. And that's really hard to do. You think you've got, so there's half the regiment, so there are about 600 or 800 of them. I mean, probably not that many. So 400 or 600 guys who have just been driven back, probably in a combination of panic, right? And the soldiers and the officers together are able to reform them back into a line, into a group of soldiers, maybe 2 people deep, with officers sort of perched around to help organize each company. That's really hard to do at all. The Marylanders have been practicing this since probably March. They've never done it in combat before. They've never done it when it really mattered, while people are shooting at them. But that's probably the most remarkable part about what they do. It's that they make their initial attack, and then they do it again. If Sterling says they do it 6 times, that's even more remarkable. But it doesn't have to be that many. It could have just been the 2. That by itself is a really impressive thing that they've just done. And they take enormous casualties. So when we say that 256 men are killed or captured, some of them are killed in the beginning of the battle, in that initial combat. We know that Maryland loses soldiers along the whole time. But most of the people they lose happen at this stand, what we're talking about. Observing from the American headquarters, we have Marylander Tench Tillman, who's, as we've heard, he's the aide-de-camp to Washington. Tillman is impressed by the men from his home state. Tillman is of course, a native Marylander, though he never fought with the Maryland unit in the Revolution. And he writes back to his father, "The behavior of the Southern troops in the late action at Brooklyn has shamed the Northern people. They confess themselves unequal in officers or discipline, training. No regular troops ever made a more gallant resistance than Smallwood's regiment. If the others had behaved as well, if General Howe, if the British commander, had managed to obtain a victory, it would have been very dearly bought." So here, this is, I know we had a smaller version of this earlier. I'd like to show this off. This is Charles Wilson Peel's portrait of George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Tench Tillman right after the surrender at Yorktown. And you can see right here that Tillman is holding the Articles of Surrender because Tillman was the one who had the honor of delivering that news to Congress. We'll take a brief moment and mention, if you have not had a chance to see this painting in person, it is in Annapolis at the State House. I hope you will get a chance. It's only about 40 minutes away. The painting itself is about 96 inches tall. It is a remarkable thing to see. We was recently cleaned within the last year or so. It is also remarkable because in the same room we have on display Tench Tillman's spurs, as well as 2 of his swords, one of which were presented to the State Archives, to the state of Maryland by his family in the 1990s. One of which is the sword that he's holding, that he's wearing in this picture, that he had at the Battle of Yorktown. So please come take a look. It's a really wonderful thing to see. A couple years ago, we had it on, actually, his uniform was on display with them as well. So his uniform is at the Maryland Historical Society. The Marylanders who take part in this famous last stand, and this happens at a place that we now call, in Brooklyn, we now call the Old Stone House, which is, if you've been to, it's right in the middle of Brooklyn. The Marylanders the units that fight in that take enormous casualties. So these are the strength reports from right after the battle, from about 2 weeks after the battle. And you can see the companies which take part in that, because they've lost between 60 and 80% of their soldiers. William McMillan and his brother Samuel are in the 4th Company. And you can see that the 4th Company, they take the most. They lose almost 80% of their soldiers. The Marylanders, so there are about 1,000 of them. They lose 256 killed or captured. They lose a quarter of their strength. But it's not losses that are equally distributed. The losses are concentrated just on this one group, to the point where after the battle, the Marylanders have to consolidate. One of the soldiers in the 3rd Company reports that, tells later in his pension application, describes how after the battle his company ceased to exist. and that the soldiers were distributed out to the other companies. McMillan is captured, and he tells a story. My brother and I, and 50 or 60 of us was taken. The Hessians broke the butts of our guns over their cannons and robbed us of everything we had. They lit their pipes with our money. They gave us nothing to eat for 5 days, and then only moldy biscuits. Blue, moldy, full of bugs, and rotten. Sometimes I will point out, sometimes we hear that 256 of them are killed, and I always like to point out that isn't true. Probably, we don't know exactly who, we don't know how many were killed and how many were captured. The records just aren't there anymore. The British didn't tell the Americans which of the ordinary soldiers, which of the non-officers they had captured, because the British didn't care. And Smallwood writes a letter back home to Maryland where he complains about this. He says, you know, we finally figured out which officers are missing and which officers have been killed, but they haven't really, they won't tell us about which soldiers they have. Because the British didn't know, the British didn't care. The Marylanders eventually did compile a roster of the entire regiment, marking who was there and who was missing, which is missing, and has been missing at least since the middle of the 19th century. Our guess is that most of the people were probably captured. We can identify about 70 soldiers who were captured, and those are the people we know about them because they come home, that there is a prisoner exchanges in the winter of 76, 77. The British don't want these prisoners. They have nothing to do with them. They have nowhere to put them, and they have no way to feed them. So they begin releasing them in prisoner exchanges. So we know at least 70 soldiers come home, but we also know that the conditions they keep the Americans in makeshift jails in New York City and on prison ships in New York Harbor are so terrible that there's so little food, they're exposed to the elements, they're rife with disease. It is estimated that there's a 50% death rate for the Americans who are captured at the Battle of Brooklyn, in that first winter. McMillan himself and his brother, they're not in New York for most of their captivity. So McMillan is only a captive until the next summer. He and a group of other soldiers find themselves in Nova Scotia, where there's only one reason why they would have been in Nova Scotia, which is that they've been impressed into the British Army. We have a number of Americans, and a handful of Marylanders, who we know were impressed into the British Army. On paper, they theoretically enlisted willingly, but joining the British Army was an opportunity to escape the prison ships and an opportunity to survive. And many of them we know were able to eventually to escape and to make their way back. The McMillan story is the most amazing story. I don't have time to tell it today. But suffice to say, they escaped from Nova Scotia and they walked back to Boston, at which point they both re-enlist and they serve for another couple of years. So the next day, right? So it's the end of August 27th, the Americans are back in their camp. And that doesn't really do them a whole lot of good because the British still have a large force in front of them. And though the British are moving fairly slowly to recover, the British have begun to make preparations for a siege to attack the American fort. They can't attack directly because the defenses are too strong. And the British are also a little reluctant to attack because of the memories of Bunker Hill, where in May of 1775, outside of Boston, the British march gloriously in lines up a hill at the Americans who just mow them down. And the British lose so many people, the ghosts of Bunker Hill are present the whole war. So the British don't launch an attack right away. They don't think they need to, because on one side, they have a large army, which is digging in and preparing to make an assault. And on the other side is the East River, which is about to be controlled by the British, who have the largest navy in the world, who have assembled the largest fleet, supposedly, between the Spanish Armada and D-Day. I don't know who counted. But just to give you a sense of the scale of how many British ships they have, the British aren't too worried. They're not in a hurry because they don't think they need to be. The Americans eventually decide to retreat. Smallwood complains that the Marylanders had been immediately put to work digging fortifications, and were among the last soldiers to be released from their work, and so they were the most tired on their way back to New York. Samuel Smith later claims that he was on the last boat back over to Manhattan, that they were so late they thought they had been left behind. Apparently, Tench Tillman was on the same boat with them. I gather the last boat out of Brooklyn had a lot of people on it over the years. The Americans slip out at night. They think they're going to try to get everybody across to Manhattan under the cover of darkness, knowing that they're sitting ducks, because any moment the sun's going to come up, and the British will notice a group of guys essentially rowing across the East River. And indeed, the sun does come up while they're still in the process of this. But amazingly, when the sun comes up, you can't see because this incredibly thick fog has descended. One of the Americans later says you couldn't see more than about 5 yards in front of you. And it's amazing. It's like in a movie, right? It is like a movie. This is like Dunkirk in America on their way, floating their way back across. And as a result, they get all the Americans back across the river into Manhattan. It doesn't much help, of course. The Americans are never really able to gain the initiative for the rest of 1776 until the very end of the year. And they spend the fall getting pushed up and around out of New York. By November, they've had to abandon the city and on the run into New Jersey. The Americans don't retake New York until November of 1783. It's the last British-held site in America, or in the colonies. There's just the British are in Canada for longer. Oh, I do have a quote from Macmillan in here. Okay. So the British put us aboard prison ships, writes Macmillan. They sent us to Halifax, where we were till the next spring. 10 of us ran away from Halifax. We were 10 weeks in the wilderness, sometimes nothing to eat for days but the moss that grows on the rocks or the bays, sometimes shellfish or snails. We survived everything but death. Both of them re-enlist. One of the brothers, so they both re-enlist in a Massachusetts unit. One of the brothers served with that unit until 1780 or 81, and he leaves the Army and goes home with his discharge. The other brother find themselves in camp with the main Continental Army where the Marylanders are. So in New Jersey in 1778. And he wanders over to the Maryland camp, and as he tells it, meets with Smallwood, who promises him a commission as a lieutenant, and he stays with the Marylanders for the rest of the war. He apparently did so without telling his Massachusetts commanders, because in Massachusetts records, he's a deserter. So I sometimes wonder whether some descendant tried to get themselves into the SAR, the DAR, through his Massachusetts service, where he's a deserter, so he wouldn't be eligible. And you just wonder, oh, I hope they know he served in Maryland, too. No, we're not there yet, sorry. We're going to talk about the Eastern Shore and the American Revolution. So we have so many stories of soldiers. So I'm going to give you a couple quick ones right now, and then we'll move into sort of a few lengthier to talk about. You think it's roughly 1,000 soldiers, and so you get a real cross section of Maryland society. That there are people who are rich, there are people who are they're laborers, they're unskilled workers, there are skilled laborers. We have a ship carpenter who re-enlists in 1777, then thinks better of it and goes home and wants to go home because, as he says, he's a better use to the cause as a ship carpenter than as an infantry soldier. They let him go home. There are a number of people who are what we would think of sort of now as being middle class, sort of small farmers. They don't own a lot of land, maybe 50 or 100 acres. Right, that's a small farm. They own 50 or 100 acres, but that's it. You think about in comparison to the wealthy planters, so like people like Smallwood who own thousands of acres. Sometimes there's some debate about what the economic status was of the soldiers in the Continental Army. Were they rich? Were they all virtuous middle-class young men who enlisted to fight for American liberty? Were they all poor people who joined the Army as the employer of last resort? And the answer is yes. It is all of these things. people joined the Continental Army for the same reason people have joined every army, because they wanted to, because they thought it would impress somebody, because they wanted to prove that they were an adult, because they wanted to fight for liberty, because they couldn't find a better job. The Jewish soldier who I write about almost certainly enlists. He enlists under a false name, and almost certainly because he needed to disappear for a little while for one reason or another. And so he takes the name Joseph Smith, which is a generic name at any point in history, and he joins the army because he needs to disappear. There's also a lot of debate about why people join the army. Probably equally important or more important is why people stay in the army. Because when you're in the Continental Army, unlike other American conflicts, when you're in the Continental Army, you can go home. You're not supposed to go home, but you can. If you're from Maryland, you know, the Continental Army spends most of its time in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. It's only a couple days march back home, and guys do it all the time. Sometimes they do it and they never come back. Sometimes they do it just to go home for the winters. We have a soldier who is in our Talbot County company who goes home 2 winters in a row. Benjamin Worthington. But Worthington actually re-enlists in the middle of that. He re-enlists to serve the whole rest of the war. He just didn't want to spend the winter in the Continental Army camp, and who could blame him, frankly? There are soldiers like Elisha Everett, who serves in 76, goes out, his enlistment ends, he goes home. He's arrested in Montgomery County in 1778 for horse theft. And he's given the opportunity to go to jail or to go into the army, so he goes into the army. A few months later, he deserts, is caught again almost immediately. The officer in charge of recruiting in Montgomery County writes, "I don't know what I am to do with him. He is clearly a worthless fellow." Eventually, he scrapes up enough money. He wasn't a rich guy, we assume. He eventually scrapes enough money to hire a substitute to fight in his place. We have people like Peter McNaughton, he's a sergeant in the 9th Company. McNaughton is, at least on paper, the longest-serving member of the Maryland line. He's captured at Brooklyn. He is impressed into the British Army. He doesn't escape back to the Americans until the end of 1778, at which point he re-enlists for the whole war, serves all the way through the Southern campaign, and is, on paper, he's discharged in late November 1783. In 1776, Maryland's companies are raised geographically. So there are companies in each county or in each couple of counties. It wasn't rigid. You didn't have to prove which county you were from, but most people enlisted in the county that was in the unit that was closest to them, or where the recruiting officer came by and you knew him, so you would trust him. If some random person wanders through who's from Anne Arundel County, and there you are in Washington County, or you don't know who he is, you don't know what he's talking about. But if one of the local community leaders shows up, you might enlist with him. You would trust him. Not all of the counties in Maryland, not all of the parts of Maryland were equally enthusiastic about the war. We know Southern Maryland, so Charles, St. Mary's, Calvert, Anne Arundel, Prince George's County, was especially enthusiastic to enlist. We know that in Western Maryland, which is full of ethnic Germans, they turn out both for some fight with Smallwood. There's a company of riflemen who fight there, as well as for the German battalion that's raised of all ethnic German soldiers as a way to counter the influence of the Hessians. Baltimore turns out lots of men. Baltimore's a big city. And the Eastern Shore produces a couple of counties. There's one raised here in Talbot, the 4th Independent Company. There's one, the 7th Independent, which is split between Queen Anne's and Kent County. And Smallwood raises a company in sort of the southern end of the Eastern Shore. They have trouble on the Eastern Shore. They especially have trouble on the southern end of the Eastern Shore because the Revolution wasn't very popular there. In 1777, before the main campaign starts that summer, they send Smallwood with a contingent of soldiers to go put down the uprising by the Loyalists. Smallwood writes home. Smallwood is just disgusted. He writes home, they have cut down the Liberty poles and in direct opposition have erected the King's standard, the King's flag. In an avowed manner, drunk to his health and his success and destruction to Congress. They have supplied the King's ships with provisions, advising the soldiers of this state and the Continental Army to desert. and not only harboring deserters, but supplying them with the arms to defend themselves against being taken again. And lastly, what can be expected of inhabitants of a place that has become the reception of deserters, escaping prisoners, and the most of the disaffected, the loyalists, who have been expelled from the neighboring states? So why? So what's happening on the Eastern Shore that makes the revolution not quite as popular? And the answer is actually pretty simple, which is the Eastern Shore felt pretty alienated from the rest of the state. Stop me if this sounds familiar. And one of the things that happens is the revolution's leaders are mostly people who had been in politics before. There are a few changes. The Delaney family were loyalists and they go back to England. The revolution, they changed the rules so that Catholics are able to vote and participate in public life. So the Carroll family gets to join the political scene. But that's really all that happens. And the folks in Annapolis, these are the ones who didn't want to burn the Peggy Stewart. They are socially friends with the colonial governor of Maryland. They allow him to leave gracefully. And so the assumption, the thought is, we didn't like these people in Annapolis to begin with. We still don't like these people in Annapolis. So if they're for the revolution, we're going to be against it. Which actually makes a lot of sense. It's hard for us to think about this now, to put ourselves in the mindset, because we're from the side that won. We're from the non-loyalist side, right? But look at George Washington. Look at his army he's raised. They can't fight. They lose all of their battles. They're fighting against the colonial master, who, according to liturgy, is the King of England has been selected by God to be the ruler of the British Empire. And the British army is so immense, why on earth would you rebel against it? And frankly, most people in America are doing okay. They complain about the taxes. But if you live out in the country somewhere, it doesn't really matter. And so they have trouble raising soldiers on the Eastern Shore as the war goes on. They do get a couple, though. So here's the 4th Independent Company, raised in Talbot County by James Hinman, or I guess Hindman. Someone's going to correct me if I get it wrong. Who is from right here. Officially, the uniforms of the Maryland soldiers in 1776 are just hunting shirts. So this gentleman is wearing a very nice example of it, sort of linen, loose-fitting, a good top layer, fringed because they were from the backcountry and they wanted to look like they were Native Americans. Mostly they were just whatever color they could get. People wore with their own. People didn't even wear them. They wore their own clothing. But Hinman is a very wealthy gentleman. His father was the state treasurer. James Hinman is the treasurer. His brother Edward is the state treasurer. All in succession. Hinman has the money that he can afford to buy them purple hunting shirts with red cuffs and red capes. They must have been remarkable, just amazing to see. The fifer and drummer, so traditionally the musicians in each unit were given alternating colors, so you could tell who they were. You weren't supposed to shoot at them. So they had red coats with purple facings, purple lapels. It just must have been an absolutely amazing group to see. They are the only unit, as far as we can tell, the only company from Maryland that ever has its own buttons, and certainly the only group that don't just say generically say Maryland. It's a picture. It's hard to see, but it says 4 ICM, so 4th Independent Company of Maryland. The independent companies were intended originally just to serve in Maryland. They are established sort of along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay as guards against the British if they come. They're not militia. Militia's just part-timers. These are full-time soldiers. But they're not supposed to just serve in Maryland. Congress pretty quickly realizes it needs more soldiers, and Maryland sends up its independent companies. So the 4th, the 5th, and the 7th independents are at Brooklyn. The 4th Independent, we don't know exactly what they were doing in the battle. They may not have been most involved in the fighting, because the captain writes a report back home afterwards saying he's very sorry to hear a report that is spread among Captain Stone's friends, John Huskin Stone, who's from Charles County, the day we were engaged on Long Island, that we behaved very ill. Such aspersions are base and ungenerous. The company I have had the honor to command has behaved themselves as well in the service notwithstanding the dark insinuations that have been thrown out against their prejudice. The company, the seventh independent company, which is from Kent and from Queen Anne's, half of it is based in Chestertown, and half of it is stationed on Kent Island at the beginning. It is commanded by Edward Vesey. His brother, Robert Vesey, is also in the company. Unusually, though, he doesn't get his brother an officer's rank. Robert is a private. One of the other officers is Samuel Turbot Wright, who goes on to be an important elected official in Queen Anne's County. He is the Register of Wills for a number of years. The independent companies have trouble getting equipment because they're not the main priority. Vesey writes a letter complaining about how the independent companies on the Eastern Shore are particularly having a hard time getting weapons. And just as one example, when they get to Brooklyn, one of the things they write down is they report what the weapons are each company has. Vesey's company has 96 muskets and 5 rifles because they didn't have enough muskets. So if you're just thinking about this from a logistics perspective, finding 2 kinds of ammunition for your company, having a company where most of the weapons load one way and you can fire, in theory, 4 shots a minute, where you also have these 4 guys over here with rifles, which it takes 2 or 3 minutes maybe to get a shot off because it takes so long to manually load an 18th century rifle. The 7th Independent Company takes enormous casualties. Only 36 out of 107 soldiers survive. The company is consolidated. They fight with the 4th Independent. Vesey is killed early on. The company, this is one of the companies we don't know very much about because after Vesey is killed, his personal papers are sent back to his father in Cecil County, up in Bohemia Manor. But his father writes back and he says, "You actually sent me the company records as well." And he said he was going to forward them back to Annapolis. And somewhere in that transit, they disappeared. So we only know who about half the company is, unfortunately. It is one of the few where we have a real genuine muster roll, where it gives you names, ages, height, and where they're from. We have a few muster rolls from 1776, mostly from other units, which are really interesting. It gives us a chance to see how tall they are. On average, the American-born soldiers are 5'8". The average Englishman at the time is 5'6". Everybody in America is taller than everybody in England because there's so much more food here. Even if you're not rich, there's better food in America. Oh yeah, here we are. So here's the letter. Captain Vesey, as well as some others, are very uneasy about the situation. All right, we're going to try to move forward a little bit, just try to move ourselves along. I don't want to keep you here all day. We'll talk about one person who is from right here in Easton, or at least settles in Easton after the war. Sergeant Thomas McKeel of the 6th Company, which fares very badly. There are at least 11 men are captured at the battle, including McKeel. McKeel writes in his pension application after the war, he gives an account which tells us a lot about the details of what happens to the soldiers. We know, generally speaking, what happens, but McKeel gives us a very nice account that tells us all of it. He says, he remained a soldier on board of a prison ship until the British got possession of New York in November. He was then taken ashore and imprisoned in New York with the Maryland officers and prisoners until he was paroled. After his release, McKeel is offered a commission as a lieutenant, which is pretty common. Maryland needs a lot more officers, and so they turn to the enlisted, to the non-commissioned men like McKeel. McKeel declines. He's told by another officer that since McKeel's a cooper, he's a barrel maker, he's better off that way, and he's more useful. And he stays as a cooper and living in Easton. He's in Easton in 1788, right as the town is established. He buys a handful of lots here. He gradually has to sell them off as clearly his economic position begins to decline for one reason or another. It's a hard time to be sort of a middle-class landowner. By 1808, he sold all of his property, including also most of his livestock, his household items. He lives until till around 1820 in Annapolis, he's survived by his wife and possibly an enslaved woman. The records are very hazy on that. Well, thank you for making it all the way through. The stories that I've told, one final thing I will note, the stories that I have told, these have been compiled as part of my project, Finding the Maryland 400, which is our project documenting these soldiers both during 1776 and their lives beyond. We have written biographies of them all, and we are now compiling the biographies and all of this other research that I have been drawing from into a book, which is due hopefully sometime next year. Publication of this book is dependent on outside funding. The state itself is not paying for this. So we have distributed brochures with information about how you can help support the project and how you can find out more. You can also take a picture of the QR code right here from your seats. You can even do it if you're watching online. I do hope you'll consider making a contribution to help us out. Thank you all so much.
That was a great presentation. I always love to hear Owen. He was actually up at the commemoration of the Battle of Brooklyn earlier this year in August, but he only had about 10 minutes and he didn't have any slides, but it was still a great presentation. But on behalf of the one chapter of the SAR and the 3 chapters of the DAR who helped to sponsor this event today, I'd like to present you with $400 for the Maryland 400. I don't know if the Maryland SAR has told you this yet or not, but I was at their annual meeting, and they voted to make a challenge grant. Have you heard about this? Okay, well, I hope I'm not betraying any confidences, but the idea is if you can raise half the $75,000, they'll donate the other half. So just to let you know. So any gifts that you might give today would help Owen raise the half he needs to raise, and then the SAR in Maryland, the Maryland Society would donate the other half. So anyway, that's what I understand is going to happen. Yeah. Okay, let's see here. I just wanted to put up a couple more slides, and then I'll let you all go. Let's see if I can find the other presentation again. And back to this. There we go. Okay, so as Owen said, if you care to donate, there's a lot of different ways. You have the brochure with the little Continental Soldier on the front that has information. You might have also gotten a flyer from the table. You could scan the code that he has. Or you can just go to the Maryland State Archives site, and if you want to donate, please designate it as the Maryland 400 Project. That's the project that Owen is the director of. And then I wanted to recognize the descendants of Colonel Tinch Tillman that are here today, but I'm not sure how many are here. So let's just ask, are the Leschers here, the Lescher family? Okay, I'm not seeing them.
Working at the election polls today.
Oh, that's where he is. Okay. I did want to recognize Catherine Murphy because I know Catherine is here today. Catherine, where are you at? Oh, she's right here in front of me. Catherine will be in the back. She brought a portrait of Colonel Tinch Tillman, and she'll be there to answer some questions if you have any questions about it. It was so kind of her to bring it. We really appreciate it, Catherine. And thank you for coming today. She's a living descendant of Colonel Tinch Tillman, direct descendant. And, Charles Burton Shreve, I don't know where Charles is, but I spoke with him yesterday. He was so excited about coming today, but from St. Mary's County, so I hope there wasn't a problem on the bridge. But he was planning to come and talk about being a descendant of Colonel Tinch Tillman, but it was his, I think, great uncle, if I understand, that wrote the definitive biography of Tinch Tillman that's on the table in the back. So just to let you know.
There's one other.
There is. Oh, who else is here?
My father-in-law, Chris Larson, is a descendant of Tinch Tillman.
Chris, would you care to stand up and say a few words about what it means to be a descendant of Mr. Tinch, Colonel Tinch Tillman? Come on up here. Come over here. Come up here so people can hear you, sir.
You're going to get me in trouble now, my father-in-law.
Yeah, you're around this way so you don't get all these corners. There we go. Feel free, sir.
It's a story that I've heard since I was a child from my grandmother. The connection is Tench Tillman generation, Frisbee Tillman, James Tillman, Lamar. You may be with Lamar, who was, I think, she was married to James Tillman, if I'm not mistaken. McCaig family, all of those. Somewhere I fall into all of that, but it's Tench Tillman that has been the focus of the family from my grandmother, whose her grandfather had a plantation in Hagerstown called Rockland, and she was born in Baltimore. Her name was Mickle. When she was raised, and eventually we moved into the Tillman situation, and it's just been fascinating. We're from New Orleans, so I've heard these stories forever. We moved up to Leesburg not too long ago because my daughter and son-in-law have 7 children. So it was the grandkids that brought us up here, but they have a house over here in St. Michael, so we're getting close to where we're able to really meet people and talk, and I've been encouraged to join the SAR for years and years, and I'm going to try and do it today. So, yeah, that's it.
I did create a family history diagram for the Tillman family, starting with the original Dr. Richard Tillman I, lived between 1626 and 1675. And you'll notice that he had a son named Richard Tillman II. There was also a Richard Tillman III there, third from the left. And over almost on the right, you say James Tillman. That was Tench Tillman's father. And then James had 10 children, and you see Colonel Tench on the left here. In the middle, he was the oldest child, and he actually married, I believe her name was pronounced Anna Maria Tillman. She was his first cousin. She was the daughter of Matthew Tillman up there on the far right-hand side. And that was very common in that era, right, to have cousins marry each other because you wanted to marry into a good family. And it was a good family. So you'll notice that Tench Tillman married Anna Maria Tillman. She didn't have to change her last name, as they say. And they had 2 daughters. The first one he met, Anna Margarita, and of course he died before his second daughter was born, Elizabeth Tench Tillman. And I'm not sure if you might know, or your father-in-law might know, which of the Tillman daughters you might have descended from. Do you happen to know?
Absolutely. I'm from Elizabeth Tench.
You're from Elizabeth Tench, okay.
And there's another girl from cousin of mine who's also a descendant too.
There's another cousin. Is she here?
Through the Elizabeth Tench group, too.
You're from the Elizabeth Tench group, too. Okay, great. Well, in the future, we're going to have to try to find somebody from the Anna Margarita group. I know that Pete Lesher and his mom, Annabelle Lesher, they are descended from Elizabeth Tench Tillman as well. Okay. From 2 to 4 today, if anyone's interested, in the room right next door, the Frederick Douglass room, we're having a little how to join the SAR or DAR, and I know the gentleman in the back told me he was interested in coming back, where we're just going to help you start to create a family tree diagram and do research online to find some of the records you would need to prove that you are a descendant of a patriot. So if anyone wants to do that, like kind of raise your hand and let me know. If I see any hands, you can come up and see me afterwards, and then we'll be back in this room at 2 o'clock to help you with some research online. And then the only other thing I wanted to do is thank our sponsors. Of course, the Maryland State Archives. We could have not done this without Owen and that whole organization. The Talbot County Free Library, I'm so happy we partnered with Dana. The Talbot Historical Society also partnered with us. The Talbot County Council and the Eastern Town Councils, they proclaim this to be Colonel Tench Tillman Week. And then we have 4 SAR and DAR chapters represented here today who sponsored this and donated the $400 for the Maryland 400 Fund. But I know we have other members of the SAR from other chapters. But those are the 4 that are here today. And then closing remarks, all I can say is this: please look forward to an annual celebration of Colonel Tench Tillman Week somewhere around the October to 1924. During that time frame next year in 2025. I'd like to thank Mr. Owen Laurie for educating us about the Maryland soldiers and Colonel Tillman. Thank you to all our sponsors. Thank you for coming to celebrate the first annual Colonel Tench Tillman Week during 2024. And if any of you choose to do so, thank you for donating to support publishing Finding the Maryland 400. That's the name of the book that they're going to publish. And that's all. Thank you so much.